The U.S. president warns of a prolonged operation in Iraq as thousands of civilians flee the onslaught by Islamic State militants. The Israelis resumed their strikes against the Gaza Strip, killing 5 Palestinians as diplomatic efforts stall. And thousands turn out for worldwide rallies in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza, voicing their outrage at the ongoing Israeli onslaught. This is Al-Ittijah World News. I'm Zainab Alawi. U.S. President Barack Obama announced his intentions to broaden Washington's military operations in Iraq after authorizing airstrikes against extremist militants. Obama, however, warned that the U.S. offensive was a long-term project aimed at rooting out extremists.
In order to mount an offensive and be able to operate effectively with the support of populations in Sunni areas, are going to have to revamp, get resupplied, have a clear strategy. That's all going to be dependent on a government that the Iraqi people and the Iraqi military have confidence in. We can help in all those efforts. I think part of what we're able to do right now is to preserve a space for them to do the hard work that's necessary. If they do that, the one thing that I also think has changed is that many of the Sunni countries in the region who have been generally suspicious or wary of the Iraqi government are more likely to join in the fight against ISIS, and that can be extremely helpful. But this is going to be a long-term project. Part of what we've seen is that a minority Sunni population in Iraq, as well as a majority Sunni population in Syria, has felt dissatisfied and detached and alienated from their respective governments. And that has been a ripe territory for these jihadists and extremists to operate. Rebuilding governance in those areas and legitimacy for stable, moderate governing in those areas.
American warplanes were once again jetting through the skies over Iraq and dropping bombs on its cities, though not as invaders, but to support the Iraqi and Kurdish armies to counter the spread of extremist militants. Contrary to what has been said and reported regarding the scale of this military operation, Iraqi Foreign Minister Hoshyar Zebari noted that most of the fighting will still be done by the Iraqis.
Mandate the terms of these airstrikes are limited to degrade ISIS capabilities, to prevent ISIS from threatening key and strategic cities like Erbil, like Duhok, and key infrastructure sites and installations in the region. But the main job, the main fight is on us. This is not a classical war. This is not a frontal war with a regular army. They are attacking with small numbers, with mobile forces, with speed. They are not holding territory.
US President Barack Obama authorized the airstrikes on Thursday, claiming that he was working towards preventing militants belonging to the so-called Islamic State from gaining more ground in Iraq and carrying out a potential genocide against displaced minority groups. However, analysts have questioned the timing of the US military involvement, since the IS had been pillaging towns and killing people across northern Iraq for nearly 2 months.
The Kurdistan region does US's bidding when making every one of its decisions. The region is also the hub linking Syria, Iran and Turkey. So the United States will not stand back and watch the region fall into the hands of the insurgents, as the southern and western parts of Iraq did.
The US operation began with airdrops of food and water for thousands of people hiding from the extremist militants in a barren northern mountain range. And though the intervention is humanitarian in nature, the US is essentially back in Iraq to fight the brainchild of its interventionist policy.
Well, to get some more analysis on this, we have Daniel Patrick Welsh. He's an anti-war activist. Daniel, good to have you with us today. So, U.S. President Barack Obama is warning of a prolonged military campaign in Iraq. But how involved is Washington going to get?
Well, I suppose it depends on what you mean by involved. I mean, ISIS is their baby. So they're going to come in and put airstrikes onto ISIS when ISIS is actually funded by their allies, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, the Gulf monarchies. So what they're doing, and you notice that this is fairly limited. Maliki said this himself, and even though they're talking about something prolonged, they're talking about pinprick airstrikes on US-made weapons that have been supplied to ISIS or stolen by ISIS. In exactly this way, if it threatens Kurdistan and if it threatens the embassy, the U.S. embassy and U.S. interests in Baghdad.
So you're saying that the Americans are talking about aiding Baghdad, but this is all really about helping the Kurdish regional government and U.S. interests in Erbil.
Absolutely. There is what the U.S. wants above all is to shackle Iraq with problems that had been suppressed and but controlled under the Hussein regime. Anything at all to avoid a stable unitary state in Iraq. And so they will help. This is kind of a carving operation, shaping ISIS's advance by saying, okay, don't go here, don't do this. But basically everywhere else in Iraq and in Syria, obviously, is just fine by us. If they really were concerned about ethnic cleansing, they wouldn't be doing it, funding it and restocking it in Gaza and funding it and restocking it in East Ukraine, right?
Well, opinions in Iraq are divided over the U.S. decision to carry out airstrikes against the Islamic State. But residents interviewed in the capital, Baghdad, appear to agree that the airstrikes were merely part of further intervention by a foreign power seeking to further its own interests.
I think the airstrikes by the United States are in line with their own interests. I think the airstrikes should have been conducted by Iraq and not any other countries. I don't agree with the intervention by forces outside Iraq, and I wonder whether the airstrikes will be effective in resolving the current crisis.
I think they are limited airstrikes, and they will not have any effect on the extremists. The airstrikes only stop the extremists from attacking the Kurdistan region, but the fight against Sunni extremists will not be easy to end.
Okay, now let's bring in Sundas Abbas, representative for the Iraqi Turkmen Front in the UK. Thank you for joining us today, Ms. Abbas. Did militants from the so-called Islamic State take a wrong turn, if you will? If they had only stayed on the road towards Baghdad, the Americans would still be calling this a Sunni uprising.
Yeah, it's strange enough that the ISIS controlling some of the towns and cities in Iraq. It started, as you know, it's 2 months ago. And when they started, you know, a huge amount of people, especially around the Mosul area, they started to flood the cities and towns, especially Tel Afar, which consists of about 400,000 Turkmen. More than 50,000 Turkmen, they fled the town of Tel Afar. They've been 2 months now with no shelter, no food, no supplies everywhere. Some of them, they moved down to the south of Iraq, to Najaf and Kalbara, and some of them, they seek refuge in Sinjar, which has recently fallen in the hand of ISIS as well. So really, they've been suffering a lot since these 2 months. Let us not forget that some other area of Turkmens have been affected badly by the situation around for example, Amirli, which have been under siege of ISIS for now nearly 2 months. People there are about 20,000 Turkmen living in there. They have no electricity, no water, no supply, no, you know, it's just like the healthcare is less. So suddenly US, they started to have action to stop the atrocity by the ISIS. Really, I just wonder why they took them so long to take such action.
And of course, the political turmoil in Iraq has only aggravated the situation. Will we see the appointment of a new premier during tomorrow's parliamentary session?
Well, I don't know really. Everything in Iraq is just like it's such a chaos, and even the dilemma in Baghdad, just to who's going to be appointed and who's going to be prime minister. This is one of the questions going to be discussed, I think, tomorrow. Let us hope they will feel that the country is in danger and they are responsible for the situation that they are in, and they take a further step and very courageous decision to just help the people down there on the ground that they are suffering.
Okay, so on that note, Daniel, back to you. To what degree is Washington holding Iraq hostage with this threat from the IS or ISIL, ISIS? I'm not even sure what acronym is appropriate anymore. Because it seems that politicians in Washington have stopped short of saying Maliki must go.
Well, they started by saying that. And I think that Maliki kind of angered them by being too close to Iran and maybe helping out Assad by letting transport of materiel through Iraq. But they are completely holding it hostage. That is the essential point. Again, look at what my co-guest said about the situation with the Turkmen. The U.S. imperial drive is not against ethnic cleansing or even genocide. It's a main part of its global push for the last, couple hundred years if you include the British Empire. It's not something that they want to stop because it's a humanitarian issue. They want to shape and carve the things that are a threat to their interests. And like I said, going back to that one thing, a unitary, undivided, and strong secular state is their biggest enemy in Iraq, because it adds to the axis of resistance that runs from Iran through Iraq, up through Syria, and into South Lebanon.
And do you think that this plan will work?
To stop that, I don't know. Part of a global push. I don't know if the plan in Gaza will work to crush the spirit of the Palestinians and drive them into the sea. I don't know if the push in East Ukraine will work to ethnically cleanse in that part of the country and kind of provoke Russia to respond. I don't know if this one will work either. You have to see it in a global context, and you have to believe that it's a cynical drive and one that doesn't have the bulk of humanity behind it, and therefore hope that it's bound to fail.
Okay, Ms. Abbas, do you have a different opinion on this? Do you think that this could work in Iraq? Even if a new government is elected, would that be enough to bring real change to the political landscape in Iraq?
Well, the way that it have been formed the government first place since 2003, and we haven't seen any changes throughout these 11 years, and even when the elections have held 3 or 4 times. But the kind of forming the government was the same. So really, I'm not hoping that we are going to see big change in the policy in Iraq, and it's going to be the same struggle between the groups. It is going to be continuing until the leaders of these groups really realize that it's not helping the country at all, and they should start think seriously to take a step towards a peaceful, democratic federal country.
Okay, and Daniel, your final thoughts on this. Where do we go from here? What will the region look like in the coming weeks, months?
Well, I think the U.S. is not going to stop its provocations either here or anywhere else. I think that my colleague who made the point about the failure of successive Iraqi governments underlines a really crucial issue, which is that the infighting only helps the aggressor. The failure to unify is the goal of U.S. empire, and they are in fact doing the bidding of the outsiders by not coming together and forming a stable government. And to the extent that they can do that, they will keep the empire at bay. And to the extent that they fail in that, it will continue to be the the pressing point of Iraqi politics and regional politics in general.
Okay, now Ms. Abbas, we've talked about how the U.S. is involved in all of this, but what about Iran? How involved will Iran be in this?
I think the neighboring countries, they have a big role in this. And I think that if they want, they can help Iraqi people to take steps towards a more stable Iraq and to help the Iraqi government just in the process to fight the ISIS and to help the Iraqi people as well. So I think they have both of Iran and Turkey, Saudi, the rest of the neighboring countries even, they have big role in stabilizing Iraq. They can help a lot Iraqi government.
Okay, Ms. Sunus Abbas, the representative for the Iraqi Turkmen Front in the UK, and Daniel Welch, anti-war activist. I want to thank you both very much for joining us today. Well, those American airstrikes have not prevented the massive exodus of Iraqi communities in areas which have fallen under the control of Islamic State militants. In Iraq's second city of Mosul, thousands of people are fleeing in search of refuge.
Scenes like these have become common in Iraq's Mosul, as large numbers of vehicles, including pickup trucks and lorries full of children and women, flood the streets. This convoy is heading to the Kurdish region's second city of Sulaymaniyah.
We fled from Karakush in Mosul. The Islamic State targeted us. We fled our houses, leaving behind our sheep, clothes, and everything. We are currently heading to Sulaymaniyah.
The minority of Iraqis are the ones most affected by the violence. Some are internally displaced, while others have become refugees in neighboring countries. These Iraqi Christians have fled the ravaged city from IS persecution and sought refuge in a church in Erbil.
Many of my family are still trapped there. Why? Why? Why can't we reach a solution? All my relatives are there, waiting. What have we done to deserve this? They are threatening them. Either they surrender or they'll pay.
Meanwhile, hundreds of Iraqis, most of them ethnic minority Yazidis, have crossed the border into neighboring Turkey. Newly arrived Yazidis were placed in state residences in the country's southeastern Sirnak province and around the nearby city of Batman.
Some have taken buses to travel to big cities. The non-governmental organizations have established a crisis desk to help those who have decided to stay here. We have been working to determine and meet their initial needs. These residences were built for disasters and they were vacant. So we housed our guests into these buildings, and as you can see, we're erecting tents.
Elsewhere in northern Iraq, thousands of Yazidis were rescued by the Iraqi Kurdish Peshmerga forces after they fled to Mount Sinjar in Duhok, escaping the violence plaguing the country. The humanitarian situation in the Iraqi city of Mosul is deteriorating day by day. Thousands have so far fled the ravaged city, and thousands more are expected to leave.
Meanwhile, thousands rallied in Baghdad in a show of support for Iraq's Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. Participants gathered in Al-Firdaus Square in the center of the Iraqi capital, demanding that the results of the recent parliamentary elections be respected and for Maliki to be appointed for a third term in office.
Since the National Alliance did not submit a letter to the parliament proving that the state of law bloc has the largest number of seats, so constitutionally and according to the Article 76, the president should name the nominee of the bloc with the largest number to form the cabinet. So the nominee of the largest bloc is al-Maliki.
Now, Israeli forces have resumed their shelling of the Gaza Strip, killing at least 5 Palestinians and injuring dozens. Meanwhile, the Palestinian resistance responded with a barrage of rockets against Israeli settlements as negotiations over a possible ceasefire falter.
On the second day of the renewed Israeli assault in the Gaza Strip, familiar scenes have returned to the coastal enclave. These Palestinians have come back to the Al Zaytun neighborhood to examine the aftermath of Israeli shelling, which transformed this mosque into rubble. And this was the moment of that attack. The Israeli military released this video which shows one of its warplanes hitting the mosque's backyard. The footage appears to be cut short. The Zionists claimed this site was used by Hamas to launch rockets.
Decent people would not attack a mosque. What is inside the mosque? Go in there with the camera and see if there are any rockets inside.
Elsewhere, 3 other bodies were retrieved from beneath the rubble of another mosque, while 2 Palestinians were killed when Israeli warplanes targeted the Al-Maghazi camp, bringing the total death toll to 1911.
They sometimes shell one house but leave damage in the whole street, and they kill all those around the place. They are not targeting anything like they claim. They are only killing children inside houses.
We were asleep, some were watching television and others were asleep. When I woke up, I was in the ambulance and then they took me to the hospital. That's what I remember. I stayed in the hospital for 4 hours.
A response from the Palestinian side came instantly. After hours of calm, which lasted throughout the night, Palestinian rockets poured onto Israeli settlements. Eshkol and Sdot Negev were among the regions targeted with more than 60 rockets. The renewed Israeli attacks come amid faltering diplomatic efforts to secure a ceasefire agreement. Talk of a long-lasting deal is now being circled around in Cairo. Resistance groups, however, vowed not to offer any concessions to Tel Aviv, maintaining that a lasting ceasefire can only be reached when their demands, which include the lifting of the Israeli blockade on the Strip, are fully implemented.
Let's get our correspondent in Gaza, Balsam Al-Atrash, on the line now for more. Balsam, update us on the latest from Gaza.
Yes, true. The Israeli occupation forces are continuing with their air raids and airstrikes all across Gaza Strip. Especially, it has intensified in this afternoon until these hours. So far, today's death toll alone is 11 Palestinians killed and more than 50 others wounded all across the Gaza Strip. The latest death was a Palestinian man killed on a motorcycle while he was going to pray in the mosque Isha prayer in the area of Deir al-Balah. 1 man was killed and more than 10 of the passing by people in the street were injured from this attack. Also, another 2 Palestinians from Rafah were killed as an Israeli airstrike hit the car they were driving this afternoon. So this raises the total death toll since the beginning of the Israeli offensive for 34 days now to 1,898 and over 10 killed and over 10,000 others injured. Also, there was a Palestinian kid today who was removed from under the rubble of their home in Shijaiya, who has been lost since the beginning of this offensive. And only today his body was recovered from under the rubble of his home. Also, there has been reports that another at least 200 people are still missing, and the civil defense rescue teams are working on finding them under the rubble and ruins of their homes in areas such as Shijaiya, Khuza'a, Zanna, and Rafah.
And what about the counteroffensive by the resistance groups? What can you tell us about that?
Yes, today the Palestinian resistance groups did fire dozens of rockets actually towards the southern Israeli settlements and Israeli cities as well. There were several rockets that hit Sderot and other rockets that had hit Netivot and Ashkelon, Ashdod as well. Also, the Palestinian resistance group said that they will intensify their hits if the negotiations in Egypt did not come to a solution or did not come to an end or an agreement that would ensure the Palestinian safety in this period, especially that now the Palestinians are living in a state of a non-war, non-peace state. So far here in the public, Palestinians do not actually know what is going on. Egypt is saying that the negotiations are going towards a long-term solution, where the Palestinians at the same time are threatening to withdraw their delegation, saying that the Israeli side has not agreed on any of their terms yet, especially lifting the siege on Gaza, which means that so far no accomplishment has been made in these negotiations, and that the Palestinian resistance groups here need to resume their rocket firing against the Israeli settlements, because the Israeli occupation forces are resuming their airstrikes and killing more Palestinians every day.
So have most Gazans lost hope that this conflict will end anytime soon?
Yes, true, because the situation here is full of contradictory. People are saying that the Egyptian side are indicating that negotiations are going fine and that they are expecting to reach a long-term solution. At the other hand, the air strikes are continuing, the air raids. Actually, there has been today a lot of bombing and shelling to agricultural areas, and the death toll today alone is 11, which means that the Israeli occupation forces claim that they are negotiating and that they want to end this conflict, but at the same time are continuing. So the Palestinian resistance groups need to retaliate, they need to fire back, and they said that they will. So actually, losing hope is becoming is a state that is becoming is starting to spread here among the Palestinians, saying that probably they might not even reach a solution, and this may leave Gaza hanging in this situation for a longer time.
Okay, Balsam, thank you very much for that. Balsam Al-Atrash there, our correspondent in Gaza. And staying in Palestine, where clashes have erupted between Palestinian protesters and occupation forces in the West Bank, as thousands of mourners took part in a funeral procession for a youth killed by the Israelis on Friday. The procession took place in Ramallah's Al-Bira neighborhood, where Palestinians marched to condemn the ongoing Israeli attacks on the Gaza Strip. Occupation forces quickly moved in and used rubber bullets and stun grenades to disperse the angry crowds, resulting in several injuries. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of demonstrators from around the world held rallies condemning the Israeli regime's brutal weeks-long assault on Gaza and called on Egypt to open its border crossing with the besieged Strip. In Yemen, demonstrators marched in solidarity with the people of Gaza, shouting slogans condemning the Israeli assault. In Australia, thousands gathered in Sydney's central business district, expressing their outrage at the Israeli brutality and blasting the silence of international community.
We took to the streets in order to show our solidarity with our brothers in Gaza who are blockaded and abused by the Zionists in collaboration with our Arab brothers. Our message today for Arab regimes, especially our brothers in Egypt, is open the Gaza crossing.
Tens of thousands have also marched across London in protest over those Israeli strikes. The protesters are also expressing their outrage at the UK government's support for Tel Aviv, after it emerged that Britain was arming and aiding the Israeli military. Pro-Palestinian campaigners and activists have staged mass rallies across the British capital over the past few weeks, with the number exceeding 50,000 protesters on more than one occasion. Saturday's march kicked off in front of the headquarters of the British Broadcasting Corporation and will conclude at the U.S. Embassy. Our London correspondent Hassan Al-Katib was at that protest, and he said it was one of the biggest rallies London has ever seen.
We're looking at maybe around the 200,000 mark. Possibly we'll get confirmation of that in the next few hours. But this is almost equaling the same number of people who came out in 2009 when Operation Cast Lead was made. The atmosphere here is great. There's people from all over the UK who came here to protest and make their voices heard, and that they were very angry and very disappointed with the way the governments have handled their own position on this particular issue. And of course, I wanted to also tell you about how the narrative has changed in the UK. Decades ago, most people, politicians, individuals, the media were always staunchly pro-Israel. Over the years, and public opinion has changed, there have been politicians who have come out and supported Palestine, and especially in the last decade or so, there's been more and more people who have come out and condemned what Israel is doing and are supportive of Palestine, especially in the last 2 or 3 years.
You're watching Al-Ittijah World News, still to come. Rebel positions in eastern Ukraine falter as the West warns Russia against military intervention. Welcome back. Our top stories are: the U.S. president warns of a prolonged operation in Iraq as thousands of civilians flee the onslaught by Islamic State militants. The Israelis resume their strikes against the Gaza Strip, killing 5 Palestinians as diplomatic efforts stall. And thousands turn out for worldwide rallies in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza, voicing their outrage at the ongoing Israeli onslaught. Al-Qaeda militants have abducted and executed 15 Yemeni soldiers in the southeastern province of Hadramaut. According to a Yemeni official, the soldiers were in a bus when they were ambushed by an Al-Qaeda commando unit near the town of Shibam. The men were then taken to the nearby village of Huta and executed. The army, for its part, said it had sent reinforcements to Huta in search of the perpetrators. Now, Egypt's High Court has ordered the dissolution of the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party. The decision comes after authorities ordered the movement to be dissolved in October of last year, before declaring the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization. Egyptian authorities have launched a crackdown against the Islamist movement since the ouster of President Mohamed Morsi in July of last year, jailing thousands of its members. Rival rallies both in favor of and against the newly elected Libyan parliament erupted across Tripoli and Benghazi. Thousands of people marched in Libya's 2 largest cities after a new parliament was elected, which Western countries hope will facilitate reconciliation. Now, this as heavy clashes between rival militias continue to rock parts of the country. Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan is looking to become the first president directly elected by voters this Sunday. Although Erdogan has dominated Turkish politics for more than a decade, he faces some tough challenges following widespread protests and corruption scandals.
With his rock-star charisma, Recep Tayyip Erdogan has dominated Turkish politics for more than a decade. On Sunday, he's widely expected to win a vote that will make him the first Turkish president directly elected by the people. Each of his rallies attracts tens of thousands of supporters.
If you look back 10 years, you see that lots of things have changed. For example, transport, health, education. Before we had inflation and we were in debt with the IMF. Today, no more.
I can now work wearing the veil. Before, it wasn't like that.
Erdogan's core support comes from religiously conservative Turks who say his Islamic-rooted Justice and Development AKP party has brought greater economic stability. But opponents say he has alienated the secular middle class, who fear he wants to Islamize the modern Turkish state. Anger boiled over in May last year in protests triggered by government plans to build a development on Gezi Park in central Istanbul. But somehow the protests, a corruption scandal, and curbs on the internet and other freedoms haven't shaken his popularity.
We were already a polarized and divided society, and Gezi only affected one side of the divide and not the other side. And he was very successful in keeping it isolated on one side.
Erdogan has already won 3 parliamentary elections, obliterating his opponents on each occasion, and there appears little room this time for the 2 other candidates, who he has mercilessly ridiculed, drawing allegations of racism and sectarianism. And though he may be the hot favourite in Sunday's vote, as he seeks his place in history, Erdogan risks becoming the leader of an increasingly polarised country.
Now, to avoid a growing humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine's eastern region, pro-Russia activists have agreed to a ceasefire. And this comes as the West's support for the Ukrainian government is becoming more blatant, with NATO aiding Kiev's military, and the U.S. warning the Kremlin that any attempt on the part of Russia to set up humanitarian corridors into the conflict-stricken east would be treated as an invasion.
Kiev's troops look determined to capitalize on the recent advances across eastern Ukraine by capturing more territory held by pro-Russian activists. On Friday, the Ukrainian military reclaimed 2 more villages. Meanwhile, renewed sporadic shelling was reported in the main rebel bastion of Donetsk. Many in the city are running scared.
It is horror. Horror, I say. If you consider us Ukraine, why do you do this to us? If you consider us strangers, leave us alone. Just leave us alone.
And now the leader of the pro-Russian rebels says that the group is ready for a ceasefire, but would stand its ground if Kiev refused to end the fighting. We are ready for a ceasefire in order to avert a growing humanitarian catastrophe. This fight will be for every street, for every house, for every meter of our land. Earlier, the rebels showed that they are not backing down in the face of Kiev's fierce assault. Ukraine's military said 15 of its soldiers were killed over the past 24 hours as a bloody 3-day battle with pro-Russian rebels forced several government units to retreat from the border in the southeast of the war-torn Luhansk region. The latest fighting comes as NATO's military support for Kiev is becoming ever more apparent. A massive NATO transport plane arrived in the Ukrainian city of Kharkov, carrying $4.5 million worth of military aid for Kiev's troops. Fighting in the east of Ukraine over the past 4 months has killed more than 1,300 people and forced a further 285,000 to flee their homes. Many of those left behind and caught up in the heavy fighting are left without power, water, and other essentials. The deteriorating humanitarian situation in eastern Ukraine is causing an increasing sense of urgency in Moscow.
We are advising Ukraine.
NATO recently claimed that Russia has amassed some 20,000 troops on its western border. The U.S. affirmed that any Russian humanitarian intervention in eastern Ukraine will be viewed as an invasion.
Therefore, any further unilateral intervention by Russia into Ukrainian territory, including one under the guise of providing humanitarian aid, would be completely unacceptable and deeply alarming, and it would be viewed as an invasion of Ukraine.
Now, as the rift between Moscow and the West continues to grow, for many of the people here, help cannot come soon enough.
The United States is using a regional meeting of ASEAN nations in Myanmar this weekend to step up its engagement in the maritime tension with China. Washington is calling for a freeze on what it considers Beijing's expansion in the South China Sea. For their part, the Chinese have reiterated their commitment to restraint, but said they would react to provocations.
The United States and ASEAN have a common responsibility to ensure the maritime security of critical global sea lanes and ports. We need to work together to manage tensions in the South China Sea and to manage them peacefully, and also to manage them on a basis of international law.
As a responsible great power, China is ready to continue to exercise restraint. However, for unreasonable provocative activities, the Chinese side is bound to make a clear and firm reaction.
Heavy fighting broke out between the Al-Qaeda-linked group Al-Shabaab and government troops in the central Somali Hiran region on Saturday. At least 18 were killed and several others wounded after the group's fighters attacked a base of the AU force in Bulbordi town, some 200 kilometers north of the capital Mogadishu. The casualties could not be immediately confirmed, but the Al-Qaeda-linked extremists said the dead included 5 of their own men. Well, a glimmer of hope seems to be emerging for those affected by the Ebola epidemic, which was recently declared a global emergency by the World Health Organization. Scientists are planning to run clinical trials of a vaccine for the virus as early as September, while hoping to commercialize the drug by 2015.
Clinical trials of a preventative vaccine for the Ebola virus may be made available by 2015, according to the World Health Organization. The head of WHO's Vaccine and Immunization, Jean-Marie Corbel, said the start of clinical trials will hopefully begin in September, first in the United States, as well as on the African continent, which has been hardest hit by the recent Ebola outbreak.
We were definitely really relieved to see that they're doing well, because it's been early days in research. We knew it worked in test tubes, we knew it worked in mice, we knew it worked in the non-human primates. The next thing on the list was the human trials. Now those are scheduled for 2015, they just hadn't happened yet when the virus broke out. And so we hadn't quite figured out dosing or dose schedule, and it hadn't ever been in healthy human volunteers. So of course we were a bit anxious, and we're just so relieved that they're doing well, and our thoughts are with them.
There is currently no available cure or vaccine for Ebola, a virus that causes severe fever and, in the worst cases, unstoppable bleeding. It has claimed close to 1,000 lives in the latest epidemic to spread across West Africa this year. Fatality rates can approach 90%, although the latest outbreak has killed 55 to 60% of those infected.
And now for some light news. The art of manual cloth weaving is one of the few surviving traditions in northern Sudan, with many residents in the area highly dependent on the trade as a source of income. Our correspondent Ahmed Saeed Ahmed gives us a look now into this ancient craft.
Industrialization and technology have both transformed the world. There are, however, many traditional crafts that have survived, albeit barely, in the 21st century. One of those is the art of manual weaving. One of the few surviving traditions in northern Sudan is manual cloth weaving. In the city of Shendi, many locals still depend on it as their primary source of income. One such example is the Sudanese couple who, for the better part of their lives and up until today, still earn their living through cloth weaving at home, using the traditional weaving system of pulleys and ropes. It is particularly common amongst the Coptic citizens of Shendi.
We, of course, produce sleeping covers, scarves, sheets, men and women's wear, such as traditional Sudanese men and women wear.
It is neither easy nor very profitable, yet it is how John and Hania make a living and can prove to be quite time-consuming. Making one sheet takes 2 to 2 days and a half. 2 days in case there's not much else to do around the house. 2.5 if anything else arises that requires standing to. John is in charge of weaving men's wear, while Hania women's wear. They spend their days working to make beautiful, colorful, and long-lasting clothing items that are still very much in demand. My wife, Hania, is the one who handles marketing our products.
We receive orders from customers, and that's how we sell our products. We don't take our products to the market. Market traders want cheap products with questionable quality. My products, on the other hand, are durable and of high quality.
The tradition, however, started with neither John nor Hania. It dates back to earlier generations.
Essentially, this vocation was passed down to us from our parents. Growing up, we started by working on minor clothing items at about 5 or 6 years of age. Then at 8, we became full-fledged workers.
It doesn't come as a surprise that customers say that traditionally made clothes are better than modern-day outfits and are also much more durable. With both John and Hania taking pride in the weaving skills, the younger generations, they say, have shied away from the tradition. Traditional manual cloth weaving is one of the few arts still surviving in this part of the country, just a few kilometers away from a major site of the pyramids, and its products are still demanded, favored and cherished by many. Ahmed Saeed Ahmed, Al-Ittijah News Channel, Shende City, Northern Sudan.
And now recapping our top stories. The U.S. president warns of a prolonged operation in Iraq as thousands of civilians flee the onslaught by Islamic State militants. The Israelis resume their strikes against the Gaza Strip, killing 5 Palestinians as diplomatic efforts stall. And thousands turn out for worldwide rallies in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza, voicing their outrage at the ongoing Israeli onslaught. That's it for today. Have a good night.